When the bombs began falling on Tehran, few Africans imagined the shockwaves would reach their own doorsteps so quickly. But within 72 hours, fuel prices had jumped 10% across the continent. Shipping lanes that carry Africa's food and fuel had ground to a halt. Airlines cancelled flights to entire regions, and in northern Nigeria, thousands took to the streets waving Iranian flags, mourning a leader killed thousands of miles away. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes against Iran. Within days, the conflict had spread across the Gulf, drawing in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Bahrain. Missiles fell on cities, ships burned in the Strait of Hormuz, and the world held its breath. But this is not a story about who fired first. This is a story about what happens when a war far from African soil reaches into African homes, African markets, and African futures. Within hours of the strikes, African capitals began issuing statements, but they did not speak with one voice. The Horn of Africa aligns with the Gulf. In the Horn of Africa, governments aligned quickly with the Gulf monarchies. Somaliland, seeking international recognition, strongly condemned Iran's retaliation. Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed called the attacks on Kuwait atrocious and pledged solidarity. Kenya's President William Ruto issued one of the clearest condemnations on the continent, warning that the regionalization of the conflict threatened international peace. Southern and West Africa take a different tone. But in Southern and West Africa, the tone was different. South Africa invoked international law, reminding the world that anticipatory self-defense is not permitted under the UN Charter, a pointed critique of the US-Israeli doctrine. In Senegal, Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko went further. He asked a question that resonated across the global South. A country, without a resolution or a mandate from the United Nations, can decide to strike other countries, to assassinate their leaders. It must be said as it is. This is extremely serious, and the whole balance of the world that has been built over the last 50 years is compromised. The African Union's warning. The African Union itself expressed deep concern, warning that the escalation carried serious implications for energy markets, food security, and economic resilience, particularly in Africa. Nigeria and Ghana chose strategic hedging, calling for restraint, urging dialogue, but condemning neither side. Abuja cooperates with Western security partners, maintains trade ties with Gulf states, and manages a religiously diverse domestic landscape. Too many interests to pick a side. Too much at stake to stay silent. While diplomats chose their words carefully, markets reacted instantly. Brent crude jumped by 10% in a single day, touching more than $82 per barrel. JP Morgan warned that a prolonged conflict could push prices above $100, levels not seen since the Ukraine war sent shockwaves through global energy markets. The producer's paradox: Nigeria and Angola. For African oil producers, higher prices can mean temporary relief. Nigeria's 2026 budget was based on a benchmark of $64.85 per barrel. Every dollar above that line brings more revenue into the federation account, more money for federal, state, and local governments. But here is the paradox: Nigeria still imports most of its refined petroleum. When global crude prices rise, the cost of imported petrol and aviation fuel rises with them. Higher export earnings on one side, higher import costs on the other. The scissors cut both ways. The importer's nightmare: Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa. For oil importers like Kenya, Rwanda, South Africa, and Ghana, the equation is simpler and more brutal. Higher fuel costs mean higher transport costs. Higher transport costs mean higher prices for food, for manufactured goods, for everything. South Africa's political leaders warned that the conflict could derail the country's fragile economic recovery. Just weeks before the war, inflation had cooled to 3.5%. The central bank was expected to begin cutting interest rates. Then the missiles flew. Frederick Mitchell, chief economist at Aluma Capital, put it bluntly. The inflation holiday could be over. Higher international oil prices, combined with a depreciating rand, will exert massive upward pressure on the domestic fuel price. But oil prices are only part of the story. The real threat lies in the water. The Strait of Hormuz, 20% of global oil at risk. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. 20% of the world's oil and gas passes through this narrow channel. When Iran threatened to close it, international shipping nearly came to a standstill. At least 150 tankers dropped anchor in open waters, waiting, watching, calculating whether the risk was worth the journey. A handful of Iranian and Chinese vessels passed through. The rest waited. The Bab al-Mandab choke point. Hundreds of miles away, another choke point came into focus. The Bab al-Mandab Strait, between Yemen and Djibouti, funnels shipping from the Indian Ocean into the Red Sea and toward the Suez Canal. The Houthis, aligned with Iran, have threatened disruption before. Now the threat became real. Major shipping lines. Suspend operations. Major shipping lines serving East and Southern African ports announced immediate disruptions. Maersk, MSC, and CMA, CGM, suspended bookings for Middle East-bound cargo. Some vessels were held in affected areas. Others were rerouted around Africa, adding weeks to journey times and millions to operating costs. For a continent that imports most of its manufactured goods and exports most of its raw materials through these same sea lanes, the message was chilling. Your supply chains are no longer reliable. East Africa's trade with the Gulf hangs in the balance. Kenya trades about $6 billion worth of goods annually with Gulf states: tea, coffee, fresh produce, manufactured goods. Ethiopia depends on the same routes for its exports and imports. Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, all rely on maritime trade that now faces uncertainty. Dr. Martin Kimani, former Kenyan UN envoy, warned that a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz would drive up grain, fertilizer, and fuel costs across Africa. It would reduce remittances from Africans working in the Gulf. It would ripple through every layer of economic life. Shoreside mourners take to the streets. On Sunday, March 1st, the Islamic Movement of Nigeria coordinated demonstrations across 6 northern states. In Gombe, Niger, Kano, Bauchi, Yobe, and Sokoto, Shiite mourners gathered to condemn the killing of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. They waved Iranian flags, they carried portraits of Khamenei, they chanted slogans that echoed those heard in Tehran, Baghdad, and Karachi. "Death to America," they shouted. "Death to Israel." Nigerian police respond with surveillance. The Nigerian police responded by calling for intensified surveillance across the north. Inspector General Olatunji Disu issued a stark warning. Any attempt to import external ideological or religious tensions into the country will be met with the full weight of the law. He directed increased monitoring around worship centers and public spaces, charging officers to quickly address any attempt to exploit global developments for local unrest. Historian Toyin Falola's warning. Professor Toyin Falola, the renowned historian, addressed this danger at a virtual forum. He warned that external aggression often strengthens domestic solidarity rather than weakening regimes. But he also pointed to a deeper risk. We do not know how the Muslim population will react. They may say the Iranians are Shiite and decide to support the Sunnis. Hezbollah has indicated that it is going to get involved. The risk of local conflicts. Dressing in global language. The risk is not that Africa will spontaneously erupt into sectarian violence. The risk is that local conflicts, local grievances, local power struggles will begin to dress themselves in the language of global war, and once that happens, they become much harder to resolve. Hundreds of thousands of Africans work in the Gulf. More than 400,000 Kenyans work in the Gulf under the Kazi Maju program. Nurses, drivers, domestic workers, construction laborers. Saudi Arabia hosts the largest share. Ethiopia sends millions of workers to the region. Their remittances are a lifeline for families back home and a critical source of foreign exchange for the national economy. Flights cancelled, airspaces closed, futures uncertain. Now those workers face an uncertain future. Airlines have cancelled flights. Airspaces have closed. Evacuation routes are complicated. Even if the violence does not reach them directly, economic disruption could cost them their jobs. Students abroad face similar uncertainty. Nigerian students on government scholarships, Ghanaian professionals on work contracts, Ethiopian traders with goods stuck in transit, all of them are now calculating risk in a region suddenly transformed. The vulnerability profile is mixed. Analyst Adewale Akintad warned that the vulnerability profile is mixed. Students on government scholarships are usually easier to trace and assist. Informal workers may be harder to reach. The responsibility, he said, falls on African foreign ministries to proactively map citizens, communicate clearly, and prepare evacuation contingencies. Crisis response capacity, not just the intensity of the conflict, determines whether nationals face temporary disruption or prolonged hardship. $100 billion in Gulf investment at risk. Over the past decade, Gulf states have become critical investors across Africa. The Gulf Cooperation Council has committed an estimated $100 billion to African infrastructure, energy, and development projects. Emirati investment built Berbera port in Somaliland. Qatari money flows into African agriculture. Saudi funds support everything from mosques to hospitals. When Gulf economies are under threat, African projects suffer, now that investment hangs in the balance. When Gulf economies are themselves under threat, when their budgets are stretched by war, when their attention turns inward, African projects lose their backers. The Africa report warned that the medium term will bring severe global economic disruptions as oil markets convulse and the Strait of Hormuz emerges as a critical vulnerability for energy importers, including many African countries. A pattern of external crises, internal costs. There is a pattern here, one that Africans have seen before. When Russia invaded Ukraine, grain prices soared and African tables grew empty. When COVID struck, supply chains snapped and African economies gasped for air. Now when war comes to the Gulf, fuel prices jump, currencies wobble, and ordinary people pay the price. The pattern is always the same. The crisis begins somewhere else. The decisions are made by others. The bombs fall on distant cities, and yet somehow the cost finds its way to African markets, African homes, African lives. Toyin Falola's Simple Truth Professor. Toyin Falola put it simply. If people think this will not affect them, then they do not understand how geopolitics works. Where Iran is located in its region is connected to Africa. Dubai is a hub. It has closed its airport since the attack on Iran. Africa is woven into the global fabric. Africa is not a bystander in global affairs. It never has been. The continent is woven into the fabric of the world economy, its resources powering distant industries, its workers building distant cities, its families depending on distant markets. When those distant places catch fire, Africa feels the heat, not because anyone chose it, but because in a connected world, there is no safe distance. The African Union's warning. The African Union warned that further escalation could deepen global instability, with consequences for energy markets, food security, and Africa's economic resilience. The question is whether African governments will use this moment to build resilience, to diversify trade partners, strengthen regional supply chains, reduce dependence on volatile global markets, or whether they will wait for the next crisis, and the next, and the next, always reacting, never preparing. This has been Voice of Africa. We document the ways the world reaches into African lives and the ways Africans respond. If you believe this perspective matters, subscribe to our channel. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that no war is ever truly far away. Where are you watching from tonight? Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Dakar, London, New York. The world is listening.